Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Western Spirit. Um, Ever since October 7th, and even before that, we in Israel have had I would say, crazy time here. Um, and I think even more crazy is for people who came here from America, from the US, like me and like our guest. And I think to get perspective from someone who spent a lot of time on campuses in America and now is in a campus in Israel. And so I think that's interesting, first of all. And second of all, our guest is a very popular podcast host in addition. And I think it would be interesting to talk to him about the Israeli economy and where we're here going from now. So Professor Russ Roberts, who is the president of Shalem College in Israel, in Jerusalem, and in the Holy City, and the host of EconTalk. I think everyone knows your podcast, so it's a great honor to speak with you.
Great to be with you, Ariel.
And I'll just say that I think about like a decade ago, I was in Friedberg Institute seminar, and that's where I met you. And ever since, I've been following you, and it's really an honor to talk to you. So let me, I guess, first and foremost, ask you about how it is to, I guess, be an ole. You're an ole to Israel. You're new, relatively new. I came here like 20 years ago. You were here, I think, a few years. And I don't know, you're here, you came here with all these protests that started, and now the 7th of October, the political turmoil, the security turmoil. How is it for you, and what can you maybe tell our listeners who aren't from Israel?
So I came here 3 years ago, actually to the day. This is the third year,
Mazel tov.
3-year anniversary of my making Aliyah. Before that, I'd been to Israel many times as a visitor, a speaker, a tourist. And we made Aliyah, my wife and I, to take this job here at Shalem College and to become part of Eretz Israel. And in English, we say it's a roller coaster. A lot of ups and downs, mostly ups. In your summer, you forgot COVID. We got here right in at the end, but there was still COVID. When I got here, you had to wear a mask on the bus.
Right.
Most of the people wore the mask around their neck rather than over their mouth and nose, but they're wearing it. So it's been a little bit, the English word I'd say is tumultuous. There's a lot of tumult. There was the political, the protests and the issue of judicial reform, of course, and then October 7th. So it's been an extraordinary experience to be in the front row of history. I mean, this is an incredible time for the Jewish people. It's an incredible time for the country. It's an incredible time for the world. And to be part of an institution like Shalem College, which is very unusual in not just Israel, but in the United States as well. It's a very different approach to education with a strong emphasis on encouraging our students to go out and do great things to make the country better. So it's a privilege. It's a privilege to be president of Shalem College, and it's a privilege to be part of this country. And I think there are many, many things that you observe as an outsider. But I'd say the most powerful and dramatic is the feeling that we're one family here, even as a newcomer. On Yom HaZikaron, it is hard to be a newcomer, and because you really don't fit in. You don't have the emotions, you don't have the experience that almost everyone here has of the challenge of Yom HaZikaron and the meaningfulness of it. And yet, at the same time, when you get here, you're part of the family, and you celebrate the good news and you cry over the bad news. And it's nothing like that in the United States. It may have been like that in the United States at certain times in its history. Certainly in the aftermath of 9/11, there was a strong feeling of unity in the United States, and lasts very long. Our feeling of unity here is mixed. It's powerful after October 7th, but it's also, it's a little bit fragile. There are obviously large political and cultural differences below the surface. But when Saturday night, when we heard that 4 hostages had been brought back from Gaza, it's overwhelming, and there's almost, again, there's nothing like that in other countries, and certainly not in the United States. And then at the same time, the bittersweetness of it, the loss of a commander who was a tremendous hero. These things just aren't available emotionally or in a sense of identity anywhere else but here as a Jew and as a citizen. It's an extraordinary place.
Professor, I would just say that Yom HaZikaron, for people who don't know, is the day of remembrance of the fallen soldiers and people also who died in terrorist activities. I would just say that I don't think you're a newcomer anymore. I think anyone who went through October 7th and saw the just what everything that happened, the downs and the ups after that, and things like you just said about the hostages, you can't call yourself a newcomer anymore, even though it's a short time that you're here, because experiencing that is something that it makes you part of the experience of the people here. So I'll just comment on that. Let me just ask something that I think just underscores what you said, and that is that you spent years on American universities, campuses, and then you came here to Israel, and you're looking back and seeing what's happening on the campuses in America, and you're seeing, I mean, I lived in New York and Brooklyn. My father still lives in Brooklyn, and I had a friend who was just visiting there, and he went to Columbia to see what was happening, and they wouldn't let him into the campus because they said that the campus is right. The police said it's taken over right now. That was basically what they told him, and I'm thinking to myself, what is happening? And it's like crazy. And someone like you who was there, maybe you can give us a sort of how you look at what's happening.
Well, I think it's important to put it in perspective. I taught at a number of American universities: Stanford, UCLA, Washington University, University of Rochester, George Mason. And they're all different, of course, but a lot of what we see on the news is all the same. It's a campus that has apparently been radicalized, not just critical of Israel, but very much pro-Palestinian, and not just pro-Palestinian, but pro-Hamas. Yeah. Celebrations of the martyrs, celebration of the idea of from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free, which means to me free of Jews, yes. Because that's the reality of countries here in the Middle East other than ours. And I think there are two perspectives I think we should keep in mind. The first is that on any campus, Columbia being one that, say, got a lot of attention that you mentioned, it's a relatively small number of students. And they were joined by a lot of people who were not students, who shared the cause or maybe even were leading this effort. And the students, as we know, have had a very imperfect knowledge of history, of culture, and what it's like in Israel, what it's like in, say, Gaza or the West Bank or anywhere else in the Middle East. And so on the one hand, it's disturbing that terrorism is celebrated. Glory to the Martyrs was broadcast in light on the side of a building of George Washington University on October 8th, I think. So that's deeply disturbing and troubling. And at the same time, I think it's important to remember that it's a relatively small group of people. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is alarming, which is, even though it's a small group of people, the people in charge, in the nominal sense of the leaders of the community, the faculty, the administration, seemed remarkably tolerant of not free speech, which you should be tolerant of. That's not alarming. What was alarming is their tolerance of exclusion, which is the antithesis, the opposite of what they claim to be in favor of on most American college campuses. They're in favor of diversity. They're in favor of inclusion. And yet, in this case, the encampment idea that it's not your campus, it's been taken over, you're not welcome here, the willingness of faculty and administrators to embrace that perspective is alarming. And I think it's alarming not just on American college campuses, but I think it's alarming in the West in general. It's an unwillingness to stand up for certain fundamental principles. It used to be the fundamental principle they wouldn't stand up for is freedom of speech. Turns out there's a certain kind of freedom of speech that's both, I'm a huge fan. I'm a big fan of freedom of speech, but not when it's coercive, not when it's threatening violence, not when it is intimidating people with the threat of violence to either not come to class, not feel that they're welcome or at home. So I think that is what is alarming about what's happening both on college campuses and in the West generally. And in a certain sense, I don't want to be condescending, but in a certain sense, you get the feeling that for young people in the West, especially, they're looking for a cause. They're looking for meaning. And the Palestinian cause, you can debate its merits. There are things to be said, certainly on behalf of the Palestinian narrative, but that it's been embraced so wholeheartedly and to the exclusion of everything else, as if it is by far the largest issue facing the globe today. That's a hard case, I think, to make reasonably. And yet I think many people do feel that way. And it should give everyone pause. I mean, we all need to think about what the significance of that is. And we don't know which direction that's heading.
Yeah, Professor, I would just say that we had an episode with Professor Larry Summers from Harvard, and he was the president of Harvard, and you know him as an economist also.
Yeah, sure.
In the Clinton administration, he was a Treasury Secretary, and I asked him if he was surprised about what was happening as the former president of Harvard, the first Jewish president of Harvard, and he said he was totally surprised. He always had these crazy people on his campus, he said, and he always tried to fight them and minimize their ability to do what they're doing now, but he never thought that it was so prevalent. And he also said something which I thought was a little bit, it's surprising that it surprised him, because he was the person in charge for so many years. And he said, I never thought that the neo-Marxist theories would be so prevalent among my professors. And I thought about, as he was saying, how did you miss this? But I guess, a lot of people did miss it because people are surprised. And another thing that's important to say is that, at least in Colombia, I have friends who study there, that a lot of the professors themselves and the faculty are in the protests. It's not like there's students and people from outside, like you said, and the whole university student body and all the deans are against this. There's actual deans in some of the departments that are going there and supporting the encampments. And then it's very weird. And another thing that, like you said, he also said that the way he has no problem with people who support the Palestinians, etc. But when his test is when they only support the Palestinian cause. So when he'll say, what about the people in Sudan who are dying of starvation? Or the people in Yemen, 500,000 already who died in the civil war, etc., etc. And they don't care, or they don't know, or they have no interest. Then he says it's already anti-Semitism, and that's at least what he said.
It feels that way, although, and I certainly think we should be, as Jews, we should be very concerned about it. On the other hand, I don't think we should overstate the dangers that we're facing as Jews per se. We have plenty of dangers we're facing here in Israel, and the Jewish people worldwide have certain challenges for sure. But a lot of, I think, what we're seeing on campuses in the last 6 months is the cause du jour, the cause of the day, the thing that's grabbed people's attention. If they knew about Sudan, and if it was in the news every day, maybe they'd march for that. And they certainly would if the United States was spending billions of dollars in Sudan. I think there's a reasonableness. I understand why we are at the front of people's minds. It is on the front page of the New York Times every day, right? Every day. And have been, not literally, but every week or so, Jews, Israel, the Middle East is the center of things. And is that anti-Semitism? Is it the complexity of the world? I don't think that's so useful to focus on. What I would point out, though, is that Marxist element that Larry Summers talked about.
Yeah.
Although I have to say in passing, I love that you said he was in charge, as if presidents do run their institutions. Shalem is a very small college, and we are more like a startup than the great, crazy, complex thing called Harvard University. There's a little more focus maybe here on where we want to go and can actually achieve it. But I think the point about Marxism is quite important. And I learned this from an economist, Arnold Kling. He wrote a very powerful and short and eloquent book called The Three Languages of Politics. And he wrote this long before the current situation. And now it's almost a truism. It's a cliche. It's everybody knows that this is how things are viewed. And that is to say, they're viewed through a lens of oppressor versus oppressed. That's the Marxist or neo-Marxist language that Larry Summers is thinking about. And it's not, often it's true. There are oppressed people and there are people who oppress them.
Yeah.
The problem with that attitude, and by the way, the conservative lens that Arnold Kling identifies is civilization versus barbarism. So he says people on the left look at the world through the lens of oppressor versus oppressed. People on the right look through the lens of civilization versus barbarism. If you're on the right, you want to preserve civilization, and you see all these conflicts as a barbarism coming at the gates of civilization to destroy it. If you're on the left, you say there are these forces of control, domination, cruelty that are oppressing the people who are at the bottom of the pile, and we have to do something about it. Of course, both are right. There are people who are oppressed, and there are cases where barbarism is at the gates of civilization. The inability to see the other side is the problem. And to have a nuanced look that in some situations, the bigger risk is oppressor versus oppressed, or the bigger risk is barbarism versus civilization. The challenge is if you only have one pair of glasses and all you do is see everything through that lens, which ideologues do on the left or the right, both sides, then you're going to have trouble, first of all, having a democracy, because you can't have a civil conversation with, because you think the other person's a lunatic. You don't realize he's actually or she's just looking at things differently than you do. And just to take an example of this, because I think it can be unbelievably frustrating and depressing if you're living here in Israel and you're on social media. I'm on Twitter way too much. And all I see day after day are two things that reinforce my view of the world, which is that Israel is having a hard time right now, and the world's angry at us and treating us unfairly. And the second thing is people are really angry about it, and it gets you angry.
Yeah.
Then you forget that the people on the other side, the algorithm of Twitter or TikTok or Facebook, has filled their feed with things that reinforce their worldview. So it's not, it's okay that people have strong views that disagree. That's what the world's about. It's unavoidable. The challenge is that all you see is facts that confirm your worldview, and all the other side sees are facts that confirm their worldview. Then you can't understand why they don't see the way you do, and you don't like them.
Yeah.
And worse than that, you think they are betraying humanity, their country, fill in the blank. And that's our challenge right now, is I think for societies everywhere, is coping with that phenomenon.
Although I would say that obviously, like, I have people on both in my family who are, let's say, liberal Democrats in America who we don't side with each other on a lot of issues, and vice versa. So I do hear a lot of the other side, and my feed is, at least on Facebook. I'm not allowed on Twitter because I can't take it. It's too much for me. But I do have a lot different opinions. I think that there is an Overton window where you could say people on both sides, all the way up to a certain point. Those are people that I'm willing to talk to. Those are people that I'm willing to listen to, and I'm taking them in good faith. But once they're outside of that Overton window that you made for everybody has their own limits, or they should have their own limits. Then it's already, it's too much. It's hatred. It's violence. There's nothing to talk about at that point. So I do think that as long as you have a certain balance of what you're willing to talk to and who you're willing to talk to, then it's fine. And so I agree with you on the main points that you made. I get my next question to you is, you're an economist, and I think the world is in a crazy time in terms of the economy. Yesterday we're recording this. Yesterday we saw that in the European Union, the turmoil, I think a lot of it has to do with the economy too, is that the right, the populist right, you could call that, a lot of it won big in the European Parliament. France is dissolving its parliament. I don't get how they have a 13-day between the dissolving of the parliament and then election. Seems great to me. That's what we should have here and in America. Would be great.
Yeah.
But yeah, my point is that we're heading, it seems, into turmoil more and more. And we did hear, I remember when it started, the whole inflation thing, they said it's transient. It's going to pass. Everything's going to be okay. And yes, we have slower inflation, I guess, in the US, but it seems that people are very unhappy with the economy in all the polls, everywhere. So where are we going? I mean, it's hard to ask such a question, but where do you think we're going basically
Well,
in the West?
I think there are a few things to think about. First of all, how people answer opinion polls about how the economy's doing or the importance of the economy. Those are interesting. They tell us something about how people are feeling. I think they tell us more about that than about the economy. For the last 10 years or so, maybe a little longer, so-called pocketbook issues, what in one election was famously described as "it's the economy, stupid,"
Yes. Bill
meaning,
Clinton, James Carville, right?
yeah, don't look at anything else. The only thing that matters is people have jobs and they can cover their mortgage, pay for their food, etc. That's always true. People care a lot about their pocketbook, their material standard of living. But what's happened over the last, I don't know again where to start it, at least the last 10 years, maybe 15, maybe 25, is that people care about something else a lot. And that is the feeling of purpose and
Yes.
meaning and belonging and identity in their lives. And, people blame the rise of Donald Trump for many things. I tend to view Trump, and he can be blamed for many things, but I view him more as a symptom than a cause, an effect more than a cause. He is a consequence of this feeling that the people have, they're not being listened to, that they don't belong, they're not important, they don't matter. It's what Brexit was about. It's also what judicial reform in many ways was about here in Israel. Of course, there's serious intellectual and governance issues on both sides of the judicial reform issue, but a lot of it is about what kind of country do we want to have here? Who's in charge? Is this a country I feel that I can devote myself to? And of course, it took an external enemy, tragically, the attacks of October 7th, to pull us together. And as we talked about earlier, we're going to see whether in the aftermath of this war, whether we can cooperate in any way and whether those divisions will just reemerge stronger than ever. But my point is that I think in the West, when you look at the rise of Marine Le Pen, when you look at the rise of the Brexit movement, you look at what's happening in the Netherlands with Geert Wilders, what you're seeing is a very different meaning of left versus right.
Yes.
So in the United States, and we know that here in Israel very well, left versus right here is very different than most places. But historically, in the United States, left versus right for a long time was only about two things. Your view of the Soviet Union, the Cold War, how aggressive the United States should be in the Cold War. And secondly, how big should the government's role be in the domestic economy? And those two issues move together, right? If you were sympathetic to communism or didn't think we should be pushing and risking war, you also tended to be sympathetic to intervening in the economy. And that was the left. The right wanted to be much more hawkish against the Soviet Union, and they wanted less government in the domestic economy. Somewhere in the last 20 years, those things in America disappeared. And not disappeared, but first of all, obviously the Soviet Union disappeared.
Yeah.
But not the question of left versus right, not the question of what should be the government's role in the economy. That should still be important. And yet, even though people care about money a lot, reasonably, they also care a lot about things about their own sense of self, their own sense of identity. And for what a complicated set of reasons we're not going to go into, a lot of people felt that the government, the elites in the United States, were not paying attention to a certain classes of people, and those people found themselves angry, frustrated. Now, they sometimes express that anger and frustration in economic terms. So they would be, say, protectionist. Yes. They would want tariffs. They would want quotas. So if you look at the populist governments, they tend to be, and populist figures, they tend to be nationalistic, which means they're anti-immigration often. They tend to be anti-trade. They don't want to have global interaction with people. And they're against the whole idea of globalization generally. They want to be from here. Here matters. Wherever here is, whether it's England, the United States, Israel, Hungary, the Netherlands. And so the issues that were there 30 years ago aren't as important in economics. What's much more important is what you could call psychological, emotional issues, whose country is this? Do we protect our jobs? Are we willing to have less expensive items, but fewer jobs in certain industry, cheaper items, but in a higher standard of living, but maybe fewer jobs in certain industries? That's going to be hard for us to, deal with it, both culturally and financially. So I think, so there's two big things. As a long rambling introduction, but I think what appears is going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years, which is very alarming, is there's going to be this issue of whose country is it? That is, does it belong to the people who were born here? Does it belong to the people who immigrated here? And does it even have any meaning, in the sense that a lot of people are what we would call cosmopolitan? They want to belong to the world. They don't want to belong to a country. They happen to live in a country, but there are other countries that are just as good, and my country isn't any better than anyone else's, and so on. That worldview is up against the worldview that says, no. We're a country. We're a nation, and we're going to have economic policies that keep that in mind. And there may be mistakes that are made because of that view, but put that to the side. I think what people care about a lot right now is a feeling that they're being heard and that their sense of identity is being championed in the capital of their country. And so, Marine Le Pen is a perfect example. I don't study her speeches or her father's in any depth, but it's pretty clear that she's not a fan of immigration. Yeah. And she feels that France has accepted a lot of immigrants who do not understand what it means to be French. That question is going to be a huge question over the next 10 years in Europe, in the United States, and I presume elsewhere too. But those are the two places that are important. And for us, as living here in Israel, it's going to have enormous impacts on the external environment that we're operating in. So I think the real issue is it's not inflation. It's not debt, although in any one country, those issues can be important. The real issue is going to be, how open are you going to be to the outside world? How much economic pain are you willing to accept in the name of nationalism? And if things don't go well, there's going to be a natural tendency to blame folks, create a scapegoat. So things could be a rough ride over the next few years.
Maybe just I pretty much agree with the analysis. I just say that maybe does what you said, because I'm just going back to the Reagan years, for example. Ronald Reagan, you mentioned the Soviet Union. We don't have that anymore. There was a common enemy. I think that's something that people rally around the flag. So we don't have that anymore, which is, I think we should have that in a lot of the West, because there's a lot of threats on the West ideologically. Cohesion is being threatened from Russia, China, etc., or from the Islamic world. And so we should have that, but we don't. And the second thing was that Reagan was an American lover, just like any. It was a patriotic thing. He was known for that, and yet his policies on the economy and America and the world were very different than what a lot of the right, what you said, the populist right, is today. So maybe the reason why this is happening is that the other side, the elites, like you call them, have gone haywire, meaning that when Reagan was president, the left, the mainstream in America, the liberal, progressive, I don't know if they were called that then, were mainstream. They agreed more or less that America was good, that they were proud to be American. And someone living in Ohio, working in the Appalachians or whatever, saw that and said, okay, they're different from me, but at least we have a common cause, that we love our country and we're doing everything what we think is right. A lot of that has gone away, and people do think that the other side doesn't care about our country anymore. The other side isn't on our side. Do you think that is something that maybe brought both sides apart?
Yeah, well, it's definitely part of it. I think we've lost in America what I think of as, quote, a shared narrative.
Yeah.
It's the same issue facing us here in Israel. What's Jewish about the Jewish state? Is it just that Jews are allowed here and otherwise it's like Norway? Does it mean we all keep Shabbat? Does it mean there's only kosher food is sold in Israel? What about the buses? What about the movies? Those issues they were very important in 1948. They're still important. We haven't really created a shared narrative. And there was a commission in the early 2000s with Ruth Gavison, and I forget who the rabbi was.
Rabbi Maidan
To try to find shared principles. Maybe that will be reopened. It would not be a bad thing, I would think. That was a beautiful effort. But the bottom line is that here in Israel, much of the West, they don't have a shared narrative anymore. Worse, they think the other person's narrative is evil,
Yes,
is
exactly.
treasonous, is a betrayal of the fundamental principles of the country. That's where the danger lies. In the 80s, when Ronald Reagan was president, the people who didn't like him, which were about 45% of the American people at the time when he was running, 48, wasn't like he was considered a saint. He won an election, and most people liked him, but a lot of people didn't like him, and they thought he was horrible. They really didn't like him. And the same was true of Bill Clinton. When Bill Clinton won an 8-year term, a lot of Americans thought he was the greatest thing since sliced bread, and a lot of people thought he was a traitor, and not a traitor. They didn't like him. The traitor part is what has changed. People who vote for Donald Trump are much more likely to think that people who vote for Joe Biden are traitors, and vice versa. People who vote for Joe Biden think anybody who would vote for Donald Trump is obviously not just a fool. Not just a fool. That was true with Reagan. People who didn't like Reagan thought Reagan's voters were fools, and people who did like him thought McGovern's voters were fools, or whoever. McGovern. Was it McGovern? Totally. No, it was.
Whatever it was.
Yeah. I'm trying to, Mondale, excuse me. Mondale, Walter Mondale, say. Or Jimmy Carter. McGovern was earlier. But that's new.
Yeah.
As a common view. Obviously, on the extremes, people always had strong views about the people on the other extreme. But suddenly the center has gotten sort of hollowed out, it feels like, ideologically, and everybody's on the extreme. And part of that's due to a lot of it, I think, is due to the news landscape, the information landscape we all live in now compared to the past. And we've not figured out how to live with that in a healthy way. And we need to.
But Professor Roberts, I was thinking about it that yesterday, it's interesting that we're talking about it, that Trump, he garners a lot of emotions around him. So whether you love him. And if you hate him with a passion, either way. And the funny thing is that when you looked at his policies, they're very much moderate policies in the sense that, I'm just thinking about it, the big hot button issues of today in America are abortion and the economy, like we mentioned, and I guess that's it. Immigration is, I'll put it aside for a second, but on abortion, he was the most moderate of all the Republicans running. He basically went after any state that put too much, restrictions, and he said, "I'm not going to make anything federal about it," etc. On the economy, he went after other candidates for saying that there needs to be reforms in entitlements. He really went after them from the left. And so when you look at him, the emotions that I think the people have about him is not about his policies. It's about what he represents. And I think that, and I see that you agree with me, so I'll just finish by saying that what he represents is that even though he's a billionaire and he's grew up in New York and he has a thick New York accent, is that he seems to people in the middle of the country, let's say, to be authentic, to be on their side. And when they look at him, they see themselves. It's a very weird thing to say about a politician, but I don't think he's a politician in the traditional sense. They see him and they see themselves. I have people in my family. They see him. They think they see him standing up for them, even though it sounds, he's a politician, but he's not. And then the other side sees him and sees the worst of the worst of the worst that you could see in someone. They see someone who's boorish, who's crass, and we could go through it, but what I'm saying is that
dishonest.
Yeah, he represents a sort of the worst and the best. There's nothing in the middle for a lot of people. And I think that's like the worst that you could have in the political discourse. And I'm not saying it's Trump's fault or it's nobody's fault. It is what it is.
Yeah, and I think that's true. The only thing I would add is that I think his character is part of what people who hate him are worried about. They're worried about an authoritarian tendency, a lack of respect for American institutions that is probably born out of ignorance. He doesn't have an appreciation, I think, of the founding and the Federalist Papers, just to pick a starting point. And they worry about that, and correctly so, in my view. But you're right; his policies, in actuality, are, I wouldn't call them parv, but they're not as extreme as you'd expect from a quote right wing demagogue, which is how he's often portrayed. But I do think part of that is his personality, his character, and on the flip side, you have Biden, who, in many ways, his policies are inoffensive. A lot of Jews are upset about Biden in the last month. He's been very supportive of Israel, starting in October 7th, has supplied Israel with all kinds of weaponry. Yes, he has tried to restrain Israel, but not very successfully. Maybe he slowed us down going into Rafah. That may not be his fault. That may be the fault of Israel's government and their lack of decisiveness. But he's talked a lot, which you have to distinguish between talk and action.
But that's also with Trump. He talks a lot, doesn't do anything.
Correct. At the same time, Biden's candidacy is horribly handicapped by his age and lack of awareness. He appears to be a very old person who can imperfectly deal with the realities of an incredibly dangerous time. So it's not, again, I don't think it's so much that he's a dove or a hawk.
He's not all there.
He's not all there, and people attack him from both sides, which is not uncommon. They think he's too left, and other people say he's way too right because they're on the left of Biden. But what's ironic about this moment, I think, in the U.S. political scene, is that each party has managed to pick as its standard bearer, as its nominee, the only person who could lose.
Exactly.
Now, they may win. One of them's probably going to win.
One of them is going to win.
If they're both alive. I'm not sure they're both going to make it to the November election alive. They're both elderly. And many things could happen between now and the election. But if they both stay alive, almost anyone, mainstream, younger, healthier, more boring than Biden would be Trump, I think. And virtually anyone mainstream from the Republican Party, whether it was Marco Rubio or Nikki Haley or Tom Cotton or any of the sort of young faces of the Republican Party who are not Trump, would destroy Joe Biden in an election. So each party has picked the one candidate who makes it interesting, which I know is good for the networks and the media, but it's good for ratings, but it's not good for the world.
Yeah.
And it's not good for America. It's a very sad thing.
Yeah. I would just say something that Ronald Reagan, we mentioned him, he was considered very old as a president.
Yeah.
And he was in the second term, I think he finished the term in his 70s. So and he was considered old. Now he's a spring chicken for these two. Biden's over 80 and Trump is getting there. So it's like you have these two alticockers who are running, and it's very weird. It's sad and weird, and I think it doesn't show good on American society too. It shows, like what you said, the lack of purpose, the lack of trusting the younger people, the younger generation. It's sort of like we're not moving forward. We still don't have the confidence to move forward. I think there is something of that here too.
I would just add, age is just a number.
Yeah.
The problem with Reagan is that toward the end of his second term, he clearly had early stage Alzheimer's. He admitted it shortly, I think, after he left office that he had it. It was a very important moment, I think, in American history that he talked about it. What I read about Biden, which I think is so fascinating, is that people say, well, he reminds me of my grandfather, because my grandfather is struggling to talk to us or struggling to remember certain things.
Or falling.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not like presidential candidates often hide their mental and physical problems. There's nothing new there. This cannot be hidden. It's out in the open in a way that's unbearably sad. And it's hard to imagine that Joe Biden will be the nominee because of
still
that.
think?
There's plenty of things to say about that. You could be shocked that Trump's going to be the nominee, but it's not on his mental ability or say his energy level, which is another factor that happens as people get older. They struggle to get up in the morning. They struggle to get their engine going. Joe Biden looks like he's sleepwalking through life. How's that going to work? How are you going to have a debate? How's he going to debate Trump? We'll say maybe I'm underestimating him. Maybe I've looked at the wrong videos. We'll see. But and then he's got this other problem that his vice presidential candidate does not seem to be ready for prime time, and seems to be very close to leaving the country in her hands. So it's not a good situation.
Yeah, I think this will be the first time the vice presidential debate will actually matter.
Yeah,
for
sure, for both of them.
Yeah, because people will be looking at them and saying, "Well, Biden, I'm not sure he'll be able to finish his second term if he's elected. So we need to see who these vice president is, because she will be the president if something happens." One thing that today I'm speaking to Art Laffer from the Laffer Curve. And one of the things that he said not so long ago when I was researching what to talk to him was that they were talking about, he's a big free market guy, obviously. And he was saying that he loves Trump because I think he also was his advisor. He gives him advice. And he said, they asked him about Trump's tariffs. And he said, he is doing this as a negotiation tactic. So he wants to bring the Chinese to the table, and therefore he's threatening them with the tariffs. He said, Trump is economically a free market guy. And then they asked him about the other stuff like the debt and everything. And he said he wants to do it, but he couldn't do it, something like that. And I wanted to ask you just in general about, I know we mentioned about why these issues are changing right and left. And without getting into specifically Trump, I do think that it's important to talk about the coming entitlement crisis of the U.S. because I think it's unsustainable. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, the U.S. is headed towards a cliff. And it's not in too long. And I think the Social Security, the actuaries say that in 2030 around, they'll be insolvent, the Social Security. So what do you think that they're going to have to hit the cliff, so to say, because politically no one is willing to do anything?
A couple things. First of all, politicians say one thing and do another all the time. I mean, Donald Trump was famous for his authenticity, as you talked about earlier, but that's mainly in his street talk, not so much his policy talk.
Yeah.
You have to mention that Ronald Reagan, who I think was probably the most articulate defender of free markets from the White House of the last 80 years. You have to go back maybe to Grover Cleveland, actually, in the 1880s, to get somebody who's as eloquent as Reagan was in the virtues of economic freedom and competition. And yet he put tariffs and quotas on Japanese cars, on steel. He, of course, had to face political reality as well. I don't see, just for the record, I don't see Donald Trump as a great free market defender. He may have some free market instincts. Most people in business don't. Actually, it's ironic. People mistakenly think that people in business are in favor of economic freedom. They are for themselves,
yes,
not for their competitors. They like to impose costs on others. And similarly, people talk, all the time about the virtues of something, and then they never do anything. So it's not. What was your other? So that was an aside. I apologize.
I was saying your question was.
No, the entitlement cliff. Yeah, the entitlement cliff. So let me say something about that. The entitlement cliff, or the crisis that's coming in Social Security, which is a combination of,
and Medicare, I think too.
Well, that was good. I was going to add that. Yeah. It's old age pensions plus old age health care. It's going to be a huge problem, and that's because of my generation. I'm born in 1954. I'm 69 years old. I'm still working, and I'm collecting Social Security. But people who are born in the aftermath of World War II, the so-called baby boom, are a very large cohort. So that's why it's called the baby boom. It's a spike in births, larger than usual birth rate in that period in the aftermath of World War II. And so the promises that are on the books to give those people pensions when they get to be 65 and older or 72 and older, the promises to pay for their health care are not credible. Those promises cannot be kept under the current legislative landscape. Now, that's what you're talking about. Say in 2032, I don't pay attention anymore. I live in Israel and I'm very happy. But in America, it's really going to be a big problem. Now, it's not a hard problem to solve. The way it will get solved, almost certainly, is there'll be a very slight, gradual expansion of the retirement age from, say, 65 to 67. For the second tier, it would be 72 to, say, 74 or 5. There'll be some changes in how healthcare is compensated, but and maybe the size of the pensions. But it's not like people will not get a pension because it's bankrupt. It will be bankrupt, but they'll avoid that by tweaking the terms of the contract. It's not a real contract. It's government legislation. Change it all the time. So they'll change the retirement age. They'll change some of the, just for take another example, I am financially comfortable, grateful for that. It's a great blessing. I have contributed an immense amount into Social Security over the 50 or so years I've been a worker. People think, oh, and that's mine.
Yeah.
So when I retire, I want my money. Well, your money is gone, my friend. It was spent ages ago when you contributed it, and I'm putting contributed in quotes, when you were taxed as a worker.
No one asked you.
No one asked me. It wasn't voluntary. It's not a contribution. It went out the door. And by the way, it did two things. It paid for other people who were old then for their pensions. It also went and paid for the war in Vietnam and paid for the everything else that America spends money on over the last 50 years, 70 years. It's not the right way to think about it. So what's going to happen? The other thing that's going to happen is that Social Security will become a little more, in English we call it, means tested. So people who are relatively comfortable, as I am, even though if I had retired 10 years ago, I would have got a certain amount, they'll say, you don't need all that as much anymore. We're going to reduce the amount you get. And the people who are really poor, they didn't contribute as much, but who don't have as much, are going to get a slightly bigger share so that we can keep the system solvent. So I think that's what's going to happen. There's going to be an increase in the redistributive nature of Social Security. We'll expand the retirement age a little, extend the retirement, the working life a little longer, postpone retiring a little longer, which will most people want anyway. They're happy working now because we're healthier, thank God. Wonderful. Most people in their late 60s aren't ready to retire necessarily. So I think America will get through that. I say that, except there's one thing to worry about, which is why you are correct that it's worrisome, which is easy to say, it's harder to do. Yeah. Is it going to be possible in the politically angry and not so healthy United States of 2030 that those kind of deals can be struck between, say, two parties, one of whom tends to represent older people and one tends to represent younger people? That is going to be fascinating to watch. I hope I'm alive. I'm looking forward to it. You can make the popcorn, Ariel, and we'll eat it together and watch the fireworks.
Russ, I have two more questions to you.
Sure.
One is about the Israeli economy. So I know you're not an expert per se about everything that's happening here, but I would
definitely not.
I just want to ask you in general. First of all, you're here for 3 years. What do you think? I mean, Israel, I remember I'm interviewing for our newspaper, Dan Senor, and he wrote about a decade ago, the startup nation. And that was the crown jewel of the Israeli economy. We have seen since the judicial reform and maybe a little before, and especially since the war, a lot of the downturn over there in terms of investment and going down and everything. It's natural, but it seems that we need to think about something else. Maybe I'm not sure, And the fact that I'm saying we need to think about, like, it's totally counterproductive to free markets. Like, who am I to think? It's the market that needs to think. But in general, where do you think we're going post-war? Obviously, not to get into minute details and statistics, because that's not your forte. But in general, as an economist looking in.
Well, I'm very worried. Not so much what you're worried about. You're worried about the fact that there's been a loss of confidence, perhaps, it's not obvious to me, but there's some concern that there may be a loss of confidence in Israeli startups and in the Israeli economy generally. And that's not what worries me. I'll come back to that because I think that's actually the better news. The thing I'm worried about is we have learned a lot of things since October 7th, and most of them are expensive. They cost a lot of money. So we learned we're very dependent on the United States for ammunition and munitions, bombs, and other things. That's not good. It has hampered our independence. So a lot of people are saying, and it's a reasonable start, that we need to make some of our own equipment. We've had a terrible shortage in everyday equipment for the soldiers.
Yes.
We had, of course, an unprecedented response to the request for reserve duty. I hear the number is 130%. So let's say 360,000 people show up and say, "Where's my helmet?" Oh, here's one from 1962. Good luck. And it's unacceptable. So I'm hoping there'll be a major commission to examine the inventory and provision of basic fundamental military equipment for our fighters. It's a terrible.
And Russ, just to stop you there, if you remember after October 7th, a lot of people in America, you had representatives from each unit talking to rich people in America. Give us money for, we need a jacket, we need a bulletproof vest.
Goggles. Yeah. They're still doing it. And because they do not feel they're getting the best equipment. Now, it's complicated. I'm sure there's a lot to be understood about it, but that's whatever conclusions we draw, they will cost money.
Yes.
We're about to be, it seems unavoidable that we will be in a war in the North. That war is also going to be very expensive, not just in the psychological toll on the people, which I can't imagine, but it seems inevitable. But that's unfortunately not the only cost. The other cost is going to be financial. We're going to be devoting more money to Iron Dome, more money to bullets, more money to planes, more money to bombs.
Yeah.
It's going to put a stress on the economy. And it's not just a short-term stress. A short-term stress, 3 months, you can deal with it. We're now 8 months into the war. On October 8th, if you said, how long is it going to take us to deal with Hamas and then turn to the North or deal with the two of them? Said, okay, 3 months, 6 months. We're 8 months in. We haven't even turned to the North. And again, I hope I'm wrong, but almost everyone seems to think that is inevitable and it's coming. So in addition to having the out-of-pocket costs of munitions, bombs, etc., you have the enormous cost of people not working.
Yes.
The young, talented people devoting themselves, good idea, necessary to the defense of the country. It's not negotiable. But the fact of the matter is that they're not working, they're not producing, they're not creating. And so this war is huge psychological toll, huge toll in human pain and suffering for people who have lost loved ones and have faced terrible injuries, but also out-of-pocket budgetary costs, and then finally unseen but very real unproduced things because so much of the working population is devoted to war. So I think what has to happen, first of all, I think it's kind of obvious that there are large segments of the population that are not doing either defense or production. We know who they are. There's obviously already an enormous demand that all parts of the country contribute, and we're going to see if that leads politically to anything.
And we'll see the Supreme Court also is supposed to give a decision soon, so we'll see.
It's not going to happen in this government without the Supreme Court, but there could be a government in the next round that will do something without the Supreme Court. But the second thing is what you talked about, the startup nation. The great engine of economic prosperity here, and obviously it could be more widespread. There are obviously certain parts of the country geographically and demographically that don't share in that prosperity, and that's a challenge, I think, for any future government of this country. But the engine of that prosperity to start with is our great creativity. It is our education system, to the extent it's good. I'm not going to comment in any detail on that. Obviously, I think it could be a lot better. I'm proud of what we're trying to do at Shalem College. But with or without great education, we have great capabilities in our people. And what Startup Nation is about is the unleashing of that innovative and creative ability to human problems. And it's probably, one of the things you learn when you move here is that I guess it's a little bit of a cliche, but it seems to me Israel's not so good at preparing for problems and avoiding them, but really good at responding to them. And so part of what makes, I think, our innovative capabilities so powerful is that that cultural aspect. We're really good at fixing things, and it should be and is a source of great pride. We have given much to the world, and I think we will give much, much more in health, in technology, in computing, in transportation. So we have. I'm very optimistic about the future of this country economically. I think the problem with the short run is it's longer than 3 months. It might end up being 2-3 years. It might be longer than that, in which case it might be very hard for that creativity, given the demands on our workforce to serve in the Army. It'll be very hard for that economy to support those needs if it lasts as long as the defense challenges might. So I'm very uneasy about that. But overall, I'm very optimistic. The things that were unleashed over the last 20, 30 years here, they're just getting started. If people here, if they don't run off to Silicon Valley or to Norway, they're going to make this country even more prosperous. And I think there are opportunities to spread that prosperity more widely with the right economic policies. And again, I'm very optimistic. I just don't want to be killed in the meanwhile. So we have to solve that problem of our security. But if we can solve that without too big of a financial cost, and by that I don't just mean budgetarily, but manpower, human capital, but we're going to be fine.
Russ, last question. Just to finish this off, we talked about the difference between right and left on economic issues. That it's basically a lot of it has been washed out. We talked about who Donald Trump is, who's the right-wing candidate in terms of economic. He's not a free market per se. So my question is, one of the things that you're known for, and I agree with you almost on everything on that point, is the importance of free markets and how much they help humanity and how much they help prosperity for all and how much they lift people up. And my question is, if on a world stage, when you look at the world, are you you just said about Israel, you're optimistic. Are you optimistic about the freedom in the world? I mean, I'm looking at, let's say, Argentina. Very good things he's doing. He's a character.
It's insane.
But he's doing, I think, in his insane way, it's better than what they had. So let's put it in terms of free markets. And then I'm looking at America, and I'm not so optimistic. And some of Europe is getting better, some of it isn't. But overall, what do you think about are you optimistic about free market economics today, or do you think we're going to have to, again, hit some sort of cliff in order for real changes to happen in most of the world?
Well, I appreciate the compliment, but to push back against both of our tendencies in terms of economic policy, if you look at the size of government or the size of regulations over decades and decades and decades, economies tend to do pretty well under there's a large range of mistakes, or maybe they're not mistakes, of policies that still allow for economic success. The real question is, is there a level that it could be so different that you would kill the goose that lays the golden eggs? And, I suggested earlier that if anti-globalization gets sufficiently strong in the economic policy area, we could have a worldwide depression, say. We haven't had 2008 was a very tough time. It really doesn't compare to 1930. It's just not the same. We have incredible divisions in the streets of Europe, in the streets of the United States, in the streets of Israel, and times are good. People complain. We talked about earlier, the economy's horrible.
Yeah.
Well, you haven't seen anything, folks. You've lived through really good times. And your idea of what a bad time is really doesn't because you don't have good perspective on that. And my worry is that even in good times, we turn to demagogues or people who are populist nationalists that you're talking about. Many of who, some of them stand for things in certain areas that might be good, others not good. Democracy itself, which we haven't talked about, is not so healthy. There's a large loss of faith in some of the fundamentals of democracy, including freedom of speech. We mentioned earlier the credibility of elections, or
the institutions themselves.
The institutions themselves of democracy, education, and so on are under threat. The media, they've lost a lot of credibility, expertise in the aftermath of COVID.
Yeah.
So we're in a very divided time, and by divided, I don't just mean we disagree. There's a lot less consensus, and there's a lot more ability of a really bad person who really likes power to mobilize people behind their banner. That's what I'm worried about. I'm not worried so much about that depression. Again, it could come, and if it does come, it will tragically, I think, advance the likelihood of the kind of political changes I'm talking about. So as long as it stays within the, quote, normal bounds, meaning you put tariffs on something, but you don't close your borders, more or less, or you don't put on huge tariffs on almost everything. If we can avoid those kind of mistakes, I think we're going to be okay in the world. But it's we're in uncharted territory, and
you're worried.
I'm worried. Yeah. Well, I'm old. Older,
yeah.
But when you get older, you get more pessimistic.
You've
seen too much.
But you also saw that it was bad in the past. So
correct. So let me end on a cheerful note. I'll quote James Buchanan. James Buchanan, Nobel Prize winner in economics from George Mason University, wonderful thinker. I once heard him give a talk where he said, when he looks to the past, when he looks to the future, he's a pessimist. But when he looks to the past, he's an optimist. And what did he mean? He said, well, you look to the future, it really looks kind of scary. I just mentioned a few things: rise of populism, rise of economic nationalism, potential for enormous tariffs that would shrink economic activity, disintegration of faith in institutions, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of bad things. We're just getting started. That was a short list. There's more. I said, but so when I looked at the future, I'm alarmed. I'm scared. But when I look to the past, I'm comforted, because I look at times in the past when there were much worse things in the moment and on the horizon. 1933 would be a good example. 1933, democracy's falling apart in the world. The depression is starting to go into full motion. Because of that, a lot of people are thinking, this democracy thing's overrated. Maybe the Soviet Union really has a better system. So there was an enormous push towards authoritarianism in free countries in America. And it looked horrible. And of course, it was horrible. We had the Holocaust. We had a world war with tens of millions of people killed. But we bounced back, and the world recovered, and it got even better. And I hope we'll muddle through this moment of unease and uncertainty with in the same way. And we might.
Yeah.
And a lot of that's in the hands of young people who especially the ones here that I see at Shalem College. Every day I get happy looking at them, because they're curious, they're ambitious, and they're idealistic, and
they have a purpose.
And they have a purpose, and they'll do great things. And so that's my hope for the future.
I would just say one last thing before I let you go, is that one of the things that is different between, let's say, students in Shalem and a lot of the young people that are in the rest of the West is that, like you said in the beginning, I'm taking all the way back to the beginning of the conversation, there is a loss of purpose in a lot of the West, a loss of meaning, a loss of sort of something that we're working for, a common good, to say, maybe put it plainly. And I think that's something that, if we want to survive this moment, is that there has to be maybe some sort of coming to Jesus moment for people who are Christians, for Jews coming to Moses, but some sort of coming to around a common flag, a common good, even from free will, not because of a government that never works, but because there is some sort of common good thing that we want to achieve. Obviously not everyone, but most people. And
the secret sauce that makes Israel successful and great is two things. We're embattled. so we feel part of our purpose is to keep this place alive as a haven for the Jewish people, but also as a light unto the nations.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter whether you're religious or not, that this is a place that has good deeds to do, despite our international reputation at this moment, which will, I believe, and hope fade and change for the better in the future. But that's one thing. The second thing, second secret sauce advantage of Israel is the family.
Yes.
The family environment here is so much healthier and so much more vibrant, and it makes a difference. And people here have a sense of purpose because of their family and because of the larger family they're part of, the country as a whole. So we have many, many great gifts to rely on that I think will help us in the future.
Professor Russ Roberts, it was a pleasure talking to you. I found it very interesting, even though a little bit pessimistic, but we'll be okay. But thank you so much. And it was a great pleasure, and we'll see you soon.
Great talking, Ariel.